Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to Song of the Exposition, section number 1. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt. We started with the very first word of this edition, the deathbed edition, the word come, an invitation. And we've worked all the way up through and including an introductory set of comments for Song of Exposition. For example, we pointed out that this was a speech, recitation that Whitman would give on the 7th of September, 1871. And because that's the case, it's going to beg some intriguing questions as we get ready to read right away the actual manuscript. For example, the poem begins with parenthetics, which will take us all the way back to the opening lines of the very first words of the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. You guys will remember this one. Come, said my soul. We're going to look at that word again in part 2. Such verses for my body. Notice capitalized, let us write. Notice the parenthetics. For we are one in parenthetics. So right away, there's a certain kind of interesting tension between the poem that we will read versus the poem that Whitman will have read out loud. We've already pointed out that these lines were added after the fact to put in parentheses this way. Also, notice the use of the word as the very first word. This will take us back to Song of Myself, passage 11, when the young woman is watching the bathing young men, and Whitman has the use of the word there. It's used a few times in Leaves of Grass. What's going on with the word and why is this the first word? Well, I think it's, again, trying to create a certain type of intimacy that Whitman loves. Let's just read passage 1. And let's already notice the balance between the 3 lines that will start this section and the 3 lines that will end it. We're going to have something to say about a scholar's ideas about what's happening in those final 3 lines. Little recks the laborer, how near his work is holding him to God, the loving laborer through space and time. After all, not to create only or found only, but to bring, perhaps, from afar what is already founded, to give it our new identity, average, limitless, free, to fill the gross, the torpid bulk with vital religious fire, not to repel or destroy so much as accept, fuse, rehabilitate, to obey as well as command, to follow more than to lead. These also are the lessons of our new world. While how little the new after all, how much the old world. Long and long has the grass been growing. Long and long has the rain been falling. Long has the globe been rolling round. Now, any number of readers of this first section have pointed out the way in which there is a certain kind of sing-songy effect. We're going to talk about that when we hit 2b in the rhetoric. Let's just start now right away with, again, the opening first sentiments of the first 3 lines. How little recks the laborer here means recks, this is the only use in all of Leaves of Grass of this word. Give attention to, pay attention to, and celebrate, we might say. So if Song of Myself is a celebration of the individual, I sing myself, here we're going to have Song of the Laborer. That is to say, we're going to celebrate what Whitman will say is foundational to America. And so the laborer is notice it's capitalized by the 3rd line. How near his work is holding him to God. Now, I've already told you guys that this idea of holding, grappling, wrestling is central, one of the central images in all of Leaves of Grass. The use of the word God, you'll remember that its first use for this was in Eidolons. We don't see it a tremendous amount, so we sit up and pay attention. In other words, the one closest to God for Whitman is not the priest. Whoa! Might not even be the poet, but it's going to be the laborer, the worker. The loving, interesting use of the word loving. Go back and just, again, the echoes are fascinating of this use of this word love and loving. And then laborer here is capitalized. Notice, not capitalized in the first line, but capitalized in the 3rd, through space and time. You'll remember Song of Myself, passage 33, the opening lines. And then as well in the poem, as they draw to a close, you'll get this space and time construction. We already commented in earlier lectures about Whitman's passion for science and the new science that was beginning to happen in considerations of both of those topics in space and time. Then there's a break, and then we will get the middle part of the first section with the words "after all," and go back and look at Song of Myself, passage 16, to see how this is going to be echoing. After all, it's almost like a throwaway. After all, you know, like that. After all, we're going to see after all, by the way, in the final line. See the balancing here? In the final line of this little mid-section. After all, not to create only, which by the way was the original title, as we said in our earlier intro lecture. After all, not to create only or found only, but to bring, and then the epistemological fallibilism, as we talked about in the last lecture, but to bring perhaps from afar what is already founded. Now, this is again this tension for Whitman between, on the one hand, the celebration of so many amazing new things happening in Whitman's own day and time, space and time. And yet, he wants to, in this set of lines, as we're going to work through all 9 sections of Exposition, Song of the Exposition, he's going to provide that tension of what Ken Wilber will call in his evolutionary model, transcend and include. In other words, we're moving beyond. And yet, there's a whole lot that's a part of this movement. Now, we've seen this already in Leaves of Grass. The prophet, Whitman, which is a P we didn't add to the 5 Ps, but the prophet Whitman, the prognosticator Whitman, is always talking about, no. America was always, predictably, always about to happen. It was inevitable, and the inevitability will come really powerful through this Song of the Exposition. But to bring perhaps from afar what is already founded. Now, what is it that we're here to celebrate? What is it that this labor, capital L, is obviously a certain kind of stereotypes, trope, to, and now we're going to get 8 of these 2, so the repetition, pay attention to it as you annotate. But to bring perhaps from afar what is already founded, to give it our own identity, average, limitless, free. We've already seen this notion about identity. Whitman is the poet of identity ontologically because, of course, there are so many identities for Whitman. He keeps promising, as Harold Bloom's pointed out in his classic essays on Whitman, Whitman always promising that he will explicate his own identity. He never seems to quite get around to it. The word average we're going to come back to later. That is to say, for Whitman, he wants to celebrate what in America is the penultimate, the average, the middle. And he loves that idea. Limitless, we've seen already a number of times in Leaves of Grass, and of course one of his favorite words, free. This idea of freedom, and again, as we said it, we're 6 years away from the celebration of the centennial of 1776. To fill the gross, that is to say large, the torpid bulk, and this idea of America being like a ship, we're going to see this in "O Captain, My Captain," maybe his most famous poem. Okay. With vital religious fire. No question, this idea for Whitman is that the true religion, as we have said, Whitman's new religion, the American religion, is America itself. Not some old faith, but the new faith. And of course, the key symbol, one of the key symbols in all of Leaves of Grass is fire, obviously. Not to repel or destroy. Now, it's almost as if he realizes, the word not here, he realizes there will be a good number of people, listeners, and then of course later readers. Far more people read this poem than ever heard this poem, as we said in our previous referencing from the Reynolds paragraph. His voice was not that strong, and unfortunately we only have one actual recording to our knowledge of Whitman's actual voice, so he wasn't able to project. So this is far more of the reading. But what is it that he's concerned about? Well, he wants to make sure that he reaches a certain kind of balance. It's the same balance that he found at the very beginning of Song of Myself, passage number 1. Do you guys remember this one? Let's just go back to it for just a second. I love to kind of point out these types of echoes. In Song of Myself, passage 1, you'll remember that he says it this way: creeds and schools in abeyance, retiring back a while, sufficed at what they are, but never forgotten. Right? I harbor for good or bad. I permit to speak at every hazard. Nature, without check, with original energy. Notice this not forgotten part. Not to repel or destroy. That is to say, all of, from the old world, from Europe. So much as, and this is what America will be. This is what the American labor will be. So much as, except fuse, rehabilitate. And obviously all three of those words are fascinating studies of their own within Leaves of Grass. The idea of rehabilitation, the idea of transcending and including, and by the way, did you notice the three there of accept, fuse, rehabilitate? The rhythms as well of this, when read out loud, are noticeable. And then he continues, not to repel or destroy, to obey as well as command, to follow more than to lead. These also are the lessons. So, in other words, his argument, and it's a fascinating one, we'll come back to it in Passage to India. His argument is that America is both a leader, but is also a follower. Much like his pal Emerson, who had pointed out the shadow of Europe, but somehow a need to escape that shadow. And so here we go, right? To obey as well as command, to follow more than to lead. These also are the lessons of our new world. And if New World resonates at all for you, you can go right back to the very beginning and the little poem called To Foreign Lands that we worked with in Inscriptions. I mean, it was one of the very first poems in all of the Deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. I heard that you asked for something to prove this puzzle, the New World, and to define America, her athletic democracy. Therefore, I send you my poems that you behold in them what you wanted. Again, these echoes now. By this point in Leaves of Grass, I'm hoping that you're beginning to get a sense of these echoes. These also are the lessons of our new world. Now, again, the fact that he uses the word lessons, obviously an important idea for Whitman as we've called him, pedagogue, that is to say teacher. Whitman is the great teacher. Of course, we saw this most clearly in Song of Myself, passage 46, 47, but notice here as well that America has lessons to teach. Now, this idea, of course, is a very, very old idea. That America is the city on the hill. America is the light in the darkness. America is what shines. Of course, our Statue of Liberty will play this game, as we've talked about in previous lectures. Whitman was the inventor, in large measure, of this idea that America would be the shining light, certainly through the American Industrial Revolution and the labor that he is going to celebrate. Lessons of our new world, and of course we comment often in 303 that the new is the new. One of the major themes, I think, of Leaves of Grass is the N-E-W, is the K-N-E-W. In other words, not everything that we think of as new is actually so new. And he says it this way, while how little the new, after all, back to the phrase after all that began this small section here in the middle of passage 1, how much the old, old world. Now we're going to see this old world phrase used in Passage to India, passage 1. So it's in his mind. Notice old repeated twice. In other words, everything that has come before has led up to this moment in time. It's a fascinating idea, culturally speaking. And to that degree, he says, whatever I'm celebrating about this labor of the new world, that is to say America, it's been prepared from way, way back. We are transcending and including all things ancient, all things especially, of course, European. And then to finish, he then has 3 lines, which will kind of, in some ways, mirror the 3 lines of the opening 3 lines of this passage. Long, and again, you're going to go, oh, I know I've heard this echo. And of course, it's from Song of Myself, passage 32, when he's talking about looking at animals. Long and long has the grass been growing. Long and long has the rain been falling. And of course, you can just, obviously we're playing with all kinds of, it's the book of poems is called Leaves of Grass, right? And obviously, rain and the refreshing quality of rain has been a part of all of this. Long has the globe been rolling round. Now, you'll remember the use of the word globe, and starting from Pamanag passage 2, you can go back and run that one to ground, as well as Song of Joys. I will have thousands of globes. You'll remember that he said we kind of messed around with that. Norton's has an interesting insight here. W.S. Kennedy, and the Conservator of February 1907 has suggested, Norton says, that these lines, these last 3 lines, are an echo of the clown's song at the end of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. A great while ago the world began with hey-ho, the wind and the rain. And I don't know, I'll leave it to you guys to decide if it makes sense. Notice, what is it that he's saying? Long and long has the grass been growing. Well, the grass is, of course, the symbol of all symbols. We have commented many, many times about biblical reference and allusions going on here, as well as quite literally printing, and we're going to get to that later in this poem, printing leaves our pages. Been growing, and this word growing is central. In fact, you could circle that one in your collection, and then just go back and look at the word grow or growing, and it will obviously take you back to Song of Myself, passage 6, when our child asks, what is the grass? Okay. Long and long has the rain been falling. In other words, it's all about growth, right? You got to have the nutrients that will come out of the ground, and of course you have to have the moisture of the rain, and obviously rain has been central to our reading of Leaves of Grass. Long has the globe been rolling round. Now it's interesting because rolling is usually referenced in Leaves of Grass to water, and yet here now he's going to talk about the spinning of the globe as rolling. Well, let's finish at 2a. What are some of the major themes here? Well, obviously America for Whitman is the product, the growth, can we say it that way? And he's going to use a lot of herb themes in Leaves of Grass all the way through, of this long cultural evolution, this evolution that started way, way long ago. He's going to give us some sense of that in this. In other words, the new is the new. And as we've said, the N-E-W, the new, the modern, is the K-N-E-W, cyclical. And this is a huge part of how you read Whitman, I believe. Whitman was tuned into this idea that while everything is unbelievably modern, it's really just a product, can we say growth, out of all of this older stuff. And I think for Whitman, this is his argument. It's not that he's breaking with Europe, it's that we're growing beyond. That is to say, again, the Wilberian evolutionary language of transcending and including. At 2b, the rhetoric, obviously the use of the parentheses at the beginning is fascinating, the use of the phrase ah. The repetition of 2, the reading aloud, and I've said to you guys before, you've got to read this material out loud, spend time with it and reading it out loud. You're gonna be, I think, captured by some of the cadences, especially early in Song of the Exposition. Some have argued that it gets weaker as Whitman goes. I don't think so. I just think he's focusing on different elements as he goes through this poem. At 3a, how can we relate this to other texts? Well, obviously there's a whole bunch of echoes that I pointed out already. I would like to, however, remind you to go back and take a look at our comments on Emerson's self-reliance. You'll remember that he makes that argument that, and he does in several of his essays, American Scholar comes to mind as well, that idea that we are standing in the shadows of Europe. And it's Emerson more than any other American of his time that said we have to move beyond, that is to say transcend, we might say, and include. Certainly that game's get played here in Song of the Exposition. By 1871, Whitman is convinced that America is the new shining light and wants to celebrate it as such. I also want to point out that Marx's Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. So think about that. This Song of the Exposition is 1871. So there are a number of readers of this poem that have already been exposed to some of the ideas of Communist Manifesto and Marx's critique of the bourgeoisie for the proletariat and all of that. We've given full lectures on that as well at learnstrong.net for those of you who want to run that study to ground. Finally, at 3b, how can we own a passage like this? I'll ask you a couple of questions. What are your views, if you will, of the sacredness of the laborer? Do you see that in our culture still a reality? Do we celebrate the average laborer, the one who built all of the stuff that we see around us? And the other is, can we or should we, in fact, transcend and include the old to make the new? Or do you think there should be a clean break to somehow try and leave the old to create the new? Or is it even possible to do that? Well, let's come to section number 2, and I use the word intentionally because, of course, the first word of section number 2 is the first word of Leaves of Grass. The invitation, of course, has come. Thank you.